March 1, 1945. Franklin Roosevelt stands before a joint session of Congress to discuss the Yalta Conference, except he's not standing at all. For the first time in 12 years as president, he's sitting down to deliver a major speech. He apologizes to Congress for the unusual arrangement, mentioning the weight of his leg braces, but nobody in that chamber is fooled. The exhaustion is written across his face. The man looks gaunt, old, like he's aged 20 years in 20 months. What Congress can't see is far worse. What the American public doesn't know is that their president is dying, and has been dying for over a year while commanding the most destructive war in human history. January 1944 brought the first warnings that something was seriously wrong. Roosevelt started complaining about headaches that arrived each evening and wouldn't let go. Those close to him noticed he seemed strangely tired even in the morning hours when he'd always been sharpest. He nodded off during conversations, and once he blacked out halfway through signing a letter, leaving a long scrawl across the page before someone caught him. The decline accelerated through early 1944, visible to anyone who spent time near him. His face turned haggard and hollow. Energy that had sustained him through the Depression and 3 years of war simply evaporated. He had lapses in concentration that left aides scrambling to cover for him, moments where he'd lose the thread of a discussion or forget what decision he'd just made. But the public saw something entirely different. They saw carefully staged performances, odd command appearances, where Roosevelt marshaled his remaining strength to project the vigor Americans needed to see. The man who'd guided them through economic collapse and global war couldn't be failing now, not when victory was finally in sight. March 27, 1944, delivered the verdict that couldn't be hidden from those in the room. Dr. Howard Bruenn, a cardiologist from Bethesda Naval Hospital, examined the president and found himself staring at a medical catastrophe. Roosevelt struggled to breathe, his lips tinged blue from lack of oxygen, his left ventricle grotesquely enlarged. Blood pressure read 186/108, a number that made Bruenn's own heart race. The diagnosis came swift and brutal: hypertensive heart disease, congestive heart failure, left ventricular cardiac failure, acute bronchitis. The President of the United States was dying of heart disease while directing a war across 3 continents. Bruenn wanted aggressive intervention immediately. Digitalis to support the failing heart, a strict low-fat diet to ease the cardiovascular burden, cigarettes cut from packs daily to just 6, and most critically, Roosevelt needed to limit his work to 4 hours a day. 4 hours. For a man commanding millions of troops, managing a domestic war economy, and negotiating with allies who'd become increasingly difficult. The recommendation made perfect medical sense and zero practical sense. Roosevelt responded well at first to Bruenn's treatment. By June 1944, he'd climbed back to his normal weight of 188 pounds, and for a moment, it looked like maybe the president could be stabilized. That moment didn't last. Come November in the election, Roosevelt weighed 165 pounds, having shed 23 pounds in 5 months. His clothes draped on him like they belonged to someone else entirely. A White House staffer saw him and thought, "I longed to tell him to get some new shirts that would be tighter at the collar, so that his neck wouldn't look so bad in the newspaper pictures." That neck became the tell for anyone paying attention. Late 1944 and early 1945 photographs show shirt collars gaping around a neck that seems to have lost all substance, like the man inside the clothes is slowly disappearing, which is exactly what was happening. Doctors tried everything to reverse the weight loss. They abandoned the low-fat diet, started eggnog supplements to pack in calories. But Roosevelt's appetite had failed along with his heart. The digitalis was stopped, hoping his hunger would return. It didn't. They restarted the medication. The scale kept dropping. The official story pointed to cardiovascular disease, but the truth was more complicated and more dire. Hypertension had probably been killing Roosevelt for years, maybe decades, completely undiagnosed. Nobody had apparently taken his blood pressure until Bruenn examined him in March 1944, and by then, the damage was irreversible. Cardiac cachexia, the wasting that accompanies severe heart failure, was consuming his body. Whispers of prostate cancer circulated but were never confirmed. Eleanor Roosevelt allegedly told actress Veronica Lake in January 1945 that her husband had cancer of the prostate gland, but no medical records exist to verify it. Those medical records vanished after Roosevelt's death, which tells its own story. Admiral Ross McIntyre, Roosevelt's personal physician, was one of only 3 people who could access them. Their disappearance wasn't accidental. Somebody decided history didn't need to know exactly when the symptoms started, how bad things really got, or who knew what when. Through 1944, Allied forces pushed toward Germany from west and east, but Roosevelt's body was staging its own retreat. The war demanded decisions only the president could make. The alliance with Stalin required personal diplomacy at the highest level, and Roosevelt had convinced himself that he alone could manage the Soviet dictator and secure lasting peace. So the man who couldn't walk without steel braces, who'd been paralyzed by polio since 1921, whose heart was now failing and whose body was wasting away, he prepared to travel thousands of miles to negotiate with the most dangerous man in Europe. He'd shaped the post-war world while his own body collapsed around him. Those closest to him saw the trajectory clearly. Anna, his daughter, saw it. Eleanor saw it but couldn't admit it, explaining away his exhaustion as psychological factors rather than accepting that he was dying. His doctors knew, military chiefs knew, political advisors knew, and they made a calculated choice. The public couldn't know. The enemy absolutely couldn't know. Maybe Roosevelt himself didn't need to know the full truth about how sick he really was. Maybe his famous optimism and iron will could carry him through if nobody told him it was impossible. What followed was one of the most consequential deceptions in American political history. Becatwinen, a dying president, would direct the final year of the war, negotiate the post-war order with Stalin and Churchill, win an unprecedented 4th term, and do it all while his body failed him piece by piece, hidden behind managed appearances and brazen lies about his condition. The question history can't answer is whether that deception was worth the price, whether Roosevelt's accomplishments in his final year justified the risk of having a man in such condition, making decisions that would echo through decades, whether a different president, or even just an honest assessment of Roosevelt's health might have produced a different world. What we know for certain is that Roosevelt was racing against death to finish the job of winning the war and building the peace, and death was gaining on him with every passing week. Admiral Ross McIntyre served as Franklin Roosevelt's personal physician from 1933 until the president's death in 1945, and he was either catastrophically incompetent or deliberately complicit in a medical deception that ranks among the great cover-ups in American history. The truth is probably both. McIntyre specialized in ears, noses, and throats. He wasn't a cardiologist, wasn't an internist, wasn't remotely qualified to manage a president with severe cardiovascular disease. What he had going for him was loyalty, discretion, and a willingness to tell the public whatever Roosevelt needed them to hear. And what the public heard, repeatedly and without shame, was that Franklin Roosevelt enjoyed robust health, that his stamina exceeded that of men decades younger, that he possessed the vigor necessary to lead the nation through its greatest crisis. Even as Roosevelt's heart failed, even as his weight collapsed, even as those who saw him daily watched him deteriorate before their eyes, McIntyre faced the press and declared the president fit and strong. Dr. Howard Bruenn, the cardiologist who actually understood what was killing Roosevelt, used diplomatic language when describing McIntyre. He thought the admiral was out of his depth, which translates roughly to McIntyre being completely unqualified for the job. Bruenn considered McIntyre's handling of Roosevelt's care a gross misdiagnosis because the man simply lacked the training to recognize or treat heart disease. Medical science for diagnosing cardiac problems was still primitive in 1944 compared to today, but even by the standards of the time, McIntyre's management bordered on malpractice. Roosevelt's daughter, Anna, finally forced the issue. By March 1944, she'd watched her father decline to a point where pretending everything was fine became impossible. She insisted McIntyre bring in specialists, real experts who could figure out what was wrong. That's how Bruenn entered the picture, and the moment he examined Roosevelt on March 27th, he knew the president was in crisis. But even after Bruenn's devastating diagnosis confirming severe hypertension and congestive heart failure, McIntyre continued the performance. June 4, 1944, barely 2 months after Bruenn's examination, McIntyre told the press that the president's health was excellent in all respects. Excellent. In all respects. For a man whose heart was actively giving out, the lies grew more brazen as the evidence mounted against them. McIntyre didn't act alone, though. J. Edgar Hoover, running the FBI, pressured doctors into silence at Roosevelt's explicit request. The administration weaponized the Bureau to ensure that anyone who knew about the president's condition understood that silence wasn't optional. Not everyone cooperated quietly. Dr. Frank Lahey, a prominent surgeon who consulted on Roosevelt's condition mid-1944, examined the president and reviewed his records before writing a memo that should have changed everything. July 10, 1944, Lahey stated plainly that he did not believe that, if Mr. Roosevelt were elected president again, he had the physical capacity to complete a 4th term. That memo should have sparked a national conversation about whether a dying man should seek the presidency. It should have forced Democrats to consider alternatives. Instead, McIntyre buried it. The public never saw Lahey's assessment, and evidence suggests Roosevelt himself may never have been told the full truth about what his doctors were saying behind closed doors. 10 days after Lahey's memo, Roosevelt announced he'd accept the Democratic nomination for an unprecedented 4th term. Eleanor Roosevelt participated in the conspiracy of silence, though perhaps unconsciously. Biographer Doris Kearns Goodwin noted that Eleanor was reluctant to admit even to herself that Franklin was really sick. Her schedule kept her traveling constantly, playing the role of Roosevelt's domestic policy advocate, and all that time away from the White House meant she missed how rapidly her husband was failing. When people tried telling her, she attributed his exhaustion to psychological factors, as if stress or depression were making him look skeletal. The stakes justified the deception, or at least that's how they rationalized it. This was wartime. The public knowing their commander-in-chief was dying could devastate morale. The enemy knowing could alter their strategic calculations. Germany was still fighting. Japan showed no signs of surrender, and managing Stalin required careful diplomacy from an American president who appeared strong and viable. But another calculation ran parallel to national security concerns. The 1944 election loomed. Roosevelt believed he was indispensable, and his advisors believed it too, or convinced themselves they did. The alternative was Thomas Dewey, a Republican who might mishandle Stalin, who might not secure unconditional surrender, who might not establish the United Nations that Roosevelt dreamed of creating. From where Roosevelt stood, the choice seemed obvious. He had to run, had to win, which meant the American people could not know he was dying. Democracy theoretically required informed consent, but Roosevelt decided that in this particular moment, with this particular crisis, the people couldn't be trusted with the truth. His medical records disappeared after his death. McIntyre was one of only 3 people with access to them, and their vanishing wasn't accidental. Somebody decided history didn't need to know exactly what those files revealed about when symptoms started, how severe things became, and who knew what when. The cover-up extended beyond Roosevelt's grave, protecting his reputation and shielding enablers from accountability. What's remarkable isn't just that they hid Roosevelt's condition, but how effectively they hid it. The press, with regular access to the president, either didn't notice or chose not to report what they saw. Photographs were controlled with military precision. Daisy Suckley, Roosevelt's cousin and close confidante, managed which images reached newspapers, selecting angles that minimized his gauntness and timing releases for moments when his energy peaked. The strategy worked. Polls showed that by September 1944, only 1.6% of voters would switch to Dewey over health concerns. By October, that number dropped to 0.5%. If voters had any sense of how sick Roosevelt really was, they were in denial, just like Eleanor, needing to believe their president was strong because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate during a world war. Medical ethics were clear then, and remain clear now. Doctors owe their primary duty to patients, not to the public. But what happens when the patient is president and national security might hang in the balance? McIntyre chose loyalty to Roosevelt over honesty with voters. Bruenn was sworn to secrecy. Lahey's warnings got suppressed. The system designed to protect presidential health instead protected the secret of presidential illness. And so a dying man prepared to campaign for a fourth term, to negotiate the post-war world, and to make decisions affecting millions of lives. His heart was failing, his weight was dropping, and those around him could only watch helplessly as he pushed himself toward a finish line he'd never actually reach. November 28, 1943 brought the first meeting of the Big Three, and Stalin made sure it happened on his terms. The location would be Tehran, Iran, because Stalin claimed his doctors forbade long-distance travel. Almost certainly a lie, but what Stalin actually wanted was to demonstrate his power by forcing Western leaders to come to him. Roosevelt traveled 7,000 miles from Washington to meet the Soviet dictator face-to-face for the first time. 7,000 miles while already showing signs of the decline that would kill him 16 months later. He arrived November the 27th in his wheelchair, brought from his accommodation adjacent to the conference venue, and witnesses noted he looked exhausted from the journey, his health already deteriorating. This trip broke something inside Roosevelt's body that never healed. And friends and family would later point to the Tehran Conference and its aftermath as the moment his visible physical decline began. Something happened there, whether from negotiation stress, the toll of travel, or an actual medical event that went undiagnosed and untreated. When Roosevelt returned from Tehran in December 1943, he became seriously ill. His doctors initially diagnosed flu, just another respiratory infection for a man who'd always been susceptible. But one of Roosevelt's close friends believed this illness marked a turning point from which the president never fully recovered. Medical historians have speculated about cholecystitis, gallbladder inflammation, or possibly an embolic event related to his already damaged heart. Whatever struck him, when January 1944 arrived, Roosevelt wasn't the same man who'd departed for Tehran. The evening headaches began. Fatigue that wouldn't lift settled in. Blackouts while signing documents started happening. The decline that would lead to Bruenn's devastating diagnosis in March had begun. At Tehran itself, though, Roosevelt focused on charming Stalin. He'd convinced himself that personal diplomacy could bridge the gulf between American democracy and Soviet communism. If he could just connect with Stalin man to man, show friendship and trust, Stalin would respond in kind. The belief was naive, tragically and dangerously naive, but Roosevelt proceeded anyway, making what historians consider critical judgment errors that shaped the entire post-war order. At one dinner, Stalin joked about executing 50,000 to 100,000 German officers after the war to prevent Germany from rising again. But he said it with a smile, the kind of dark humor Stalin used to test his counterparts. Churchill recoiled and said so plainly, Roosevelt, perhaps trying to ease tension, perhaps not thinking clearly, joked back that maybe 49,000 would be enough. Was it humor? Exhaustion? Or was the President of the United States actually entertaining Stalin's mass execution proposal? The transcript doesn't convey tone, leaving history to guess at intent. What it reveals, though, is something troubling about Roosevelt's state of mind at Tehran. The major outcome of Tehran was commitment to Operation Overlord, the invasion of France set for May 1944. Stalin had been demanding a second front since 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Churchill had advocated continuing Mediterranean operations, knowing a cross-channel invasion was impossible in 1943 due to shipping shortages. At Tehran, though, Stalin's pressure combined with Roosevelt's desire to please him produced a firm commitment. D-Day would happen in May 1944. Stalin got what he wanted, and in return he made promises. He'd launch a concurrent offensive on Germany's Eastern Front to divert forces from France. He'd enter the war against Japan once Germany was defeated. He discussed, though didn't finalize, Poland's post-war borders. Poland. That's where Tehran's tragedy becomes clear. Stalin insisted Poland's eastern border should match the Curzon line established by the British in 1920, giving the Soviet Union significant Polish territory. To compensate Poland, borders would shift westward, taking land from Germany. The Polish government in exile in London wasn't consulted. Their country was being carved up by three men in Tehran, and the Poles had no voice. Roosevelt and Churchill went along with it. They recognized Stalin's dominant position, his armies advancing across Eastern Europe, his leverage as the power actually fighting and defeating the bulk of German forces. But they also made a critical assumption, that Stalin's promises about Poland's future freedom meant something, that free elections in Eastern Europe would actually be free. Throughout the conference, Roosevelt tried building personal rapport with Stalin. He stayed in accommodations adjacent to the Soviet embassy, supposedly for security after warnings of assassination plots. The warnings were almost certainly fabricated by Soviet intelligence to get Roosevelt into Stalin's compound where his conversations could be monitored. Stalin's NKVD bugged British and American quarters, giving the Soviet leader advance knowledge of what Churchill and Roosevelt were thinking. Roosevelt was being played, and he may have been too ill or too invested in his charm offensive to realize it. Averell Harriman, Roosevelt's ambassador to the Soviet Union, later said the president had no conception of the determination of the Russians to settle matters in which they consider that they have a vital interest in their own manner. Charles Bolin, who translated for Roosevelt, said the president didn't understand the great gulf that separated the thinking of a Bolshevik from a non-Bolshevik. Roosevelt believed he could bridge that gulf, though. Personal diplomacy, human connection overcoming ideology. That's what he had faith in. His declining health may have made him more susceptible to that belief. A healthy man might have been more skeptical, more clear-eyed about Stalin's nature. A man fighting to stay conscious during meetings, whose heart was failing, might cling more desperately to hope that charm and goodwill could work. The conference lasted 4 days. By the end, Roosevelt was exhausted. The journey home would be just as brutal as getting there, 7,000 miles back to Washington, while his body struggled to function. Within weeks of his return, and the illness that friends marked as the turning point struck him down. Tehran set the pattern for what would follow at Yalta 14 months later. Stalin dictating terms, Roosevelt trying to charm him into cooperation, Churchill caught in the middle, recognizing the danger but unwilling to break the alliance, winning the war. And Roosevelt, his health declining, his judgment possibly impaired, making concessions that would echo through decades of Cold War. The decisions made at Tehran weren't necessarily wrong given the military situation. The Second Front in France was necessary. Soviet entry into the Pacific War would save American lives. Poland's borders were always going to be problematic with Soviet armies controlling Eastern Europe. The question that haunts history, though, is whether a healthy Roosevelt would have negotiated differently. Would he have been more skeptical of Stalin's promises? Would he have pushed harder for enforcement mechanisms rather than relying on trust? Would he have seen Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe more clearly? We can't know. What we know is that Roosevelt left Tehran exhausted, returned to Washington, and became seriously ill, that within months he'd be diagnosed with congestive heart failure, and that 14 months later he'd return to negotiate with Stalin again, this time as a man visibly dying. Tehran was the warning sign, the moment when anyone paying attention should have realized the president wasn't well. But the cover-up was just beginning, and the most consequential deception was still ahead. Summer 1944 brought Democratic Party leaders face to face with a problem they couldn't discuss publicly. Their president was dying, everyone in the inner circle knew it, and he was insisting on running for an unprecedented fourth term. The math was brutal and unavoidable. Roosevelt had just turned 62, his heart was failing, and Dr. Frank Lahey had just written a memo stating flatly that Roosevelt lacked the physical capacity to complete a fourth term. If Roosevelt won in November 1944, the vice president would almost certainly become president before 1948, which meant choosing a vice president wasn't just important anymore. It was choosing who would actually be president. Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's current vice president, made party leaders nervous. Too liberal, too sympathetic to the Soviets, too unpredictable. The Democratic establishment wanted him gone, and Roosevelt's failing health gave them the leverage to make it happen. Harry Truman got chosen precisely because Roosevelt might not survive. A moderate Democrat from Missouri, someone the party could live with, someone who wouldn't rock the boat. Nobody expected greatness from Truman. They just needed someone ready to step in when Roosevelt died. Except nobody told Truman that's why he was picked. Nobody prepared him for the presidency. Nobody briefed him on the atomic bomb or Soviet negotiation details or military strategy in the Pacific. Roosevelt kept Truman almost completely in the dark, meeting with him only twice between the January 1945 inauguration and Roosevelt's death in April. It was irresponsible. Criminally irresponsible. But Roosevelt either believed he'd survive or couldn't face his own mortality enough to prepare his successor. July 20th, 1944. 10 days after Lahey's memo warning Roosevelt couldn't finish another term, the president announced he'd accept the Democratic nomination. The statement came carefully worded, reluctant sounding, the posture of a man being drafted against his wishes. If the people command me to continue in this office and in this war, I have as little right to withdraw as the soldier has to leave his post in the line. Masterful politics and complete fiction. Roosevelt wanted to run. He believed he was indispensable, convinced himself that only he could manage Stalin, only he could see the war through, only he could establish the United Nations. The campaign that followed wasn't normal, though. It was a carefully choreographed performance designed to convince Americans their president was healthy enough to serve 4 more years. Roosevelt delivered a few command performances that quieted concerns. October 21st, 1944, he rode in an open car through New York City for 4 hours in cold, driving rain. The motorcade was designed to prove vigor, to show he could endure physical hardship. He appeared before crowds soaking wet, waving and smiling, projecting strength. What crowds didn't see was the toll it took, the exhaustion afterward, the way his staff had to manage his energy for days before and after. His fireside chats got timed for moments when Roosevelt had maximum energy. His schedule was cleared for hours beforehand so he could rest. Photographs were controlled with military precision, and his cousin Daisy Suckley managing images that reached newspapers, making sure unflattering photos never saw publication. The Teamsters Union speech on September 23rd became legendary. Roosevelt woke up with laryngitis that morning, but it cleared in time. He delivered a fighting speech that reminded Americans of the leader they remembered, his delivery strong, his humor sharp. For one evening, the old Roosevelt was back. Between public appearances, though, Roosevelt was often too tired to work. His staff shortened his schedule, his attention wandered in meetings. He needed frequent breaks. The 4-hour workday Bruenn had prescribed was impossible, but Roosevelt was barely managing 6. The deception worked anyway. Polling showed health concerns barely registered with voters. In September, surveys found only 1.6% would switch to Dewey over the president's condition. By October, that dropped to 0.5%. The press had little appetite for investigating the commander-in-chief's fitness during wartime. Questioning whether the president was healthy enough to lead, while American boys died on European and Pacific battlefields, seemed unpatriotic, potentially treasonous. Thomas Dewey, the Republican nominee, faced an impossible choice. His campaign had reports about Roosevelt's health and knew something was seriously wrong. But raising it directly risked massive backlash in the wartime atmosphere. Americans might see it as undermining the presidency itself, as giving aid and comfort to the enemy, by suggesting their leader was weak. Dewey pulled his punches, campaigning against Roosevelt's policies rather than his health. Roosevelt won, though by his narrowest margin ever, 53.4% to Dewey's 45.9%. The Electoral College was more decisive at 432 to 99, but the popular vote showed an electorate less enthusiastic about a fourth term than they'd been about the previous 3. November 1944. Roosevelt had won, and Democratic Party insiders knew they'd just elected a dead man walking. The only question was how long he'd last, and whether he'd survive long enough to see the war's end. The price of deception was Harry Truman's unpreparedness. When Roosevelt died, Truman told reporters, "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." He'd been vice president for 82 days and barely spoken with Roosevelt. And he didn't know about the Manhattan Project, didn't know what had been promised at Tehran, didn't understand the complicated relationship with Stalin or the extent of Soviet penetration into Eastern Europe. Roosevelt won the election by keeping truth from the American people, but he also ensured that when he died, his successor would stumble blind into the most critical period of the 20th century. The atomic bomb, the war's end, the Cold War's beginning, the division of Europe, all of it would fall to a man kept in the dark because Roosevelt couldn't face his own mortality. The 1944 election was democracy subverted by necessity, or at least by what Roosevelt told himself was necessity. The people voted, but without crucial information. They chose a president who wouldn't finish his term paired with a vice president who wasn't ready to assume the office. And in 3 months, that dying president would travel to Yalta to negotiate the post-war world with Stalin. He'd make decisions echoing for half a century, binding Eastern Europe to Soviet control and setting the stage for the Cold War. All while his body failed him, his mind fought through exhaustion, and those around him watched helplessly as history pivoted on the judgment of a man racing toward death. January 20th, 1945. Franklin Roosevelt took the oath of office for the 4th time, and anyone paying attention could see he was dying. The inauguration was brief, held at the White House rather than the Capitol to spare him strain. His speech lasted just 5 minutes. He looked gaunt, hollow, like a man being consumed from within. 2 days later, he departed on what would become the most grueling journey of his presidency. 5 weeks, 6,000 miles, to the Crimean resort town of Yalta, where Stalin had insisted the Big Three meet to shape the post-war world. Stalin claimed his doctors forbade long trips, almost certainly a power play forcing Western leaders to come to him while Soviet armies controlled Eastern Europe, and stood 40 miles from Berlin. Roosevelt, whose own doctors had begged him not to go, had to make an exhausting journey that would accelerate his death. He flew from Washington to Malta, then 1,400 miles to Crimea, followed by an 8-hour drive over rough mountain roads to Yalta. Churchill, over 70 himself, made the same brutal journey. Churchill's health was declining, but not catastrophic. Roosevelt's was. February 4th through 11th, 1945. The Yalta Conference. Roosevelt's blood pressure during the conference measured 220/120, hypertensive crisis level, the kind of reading where doctors normally hospitalize patients immediately. Roosevelt sat through days of negotiations anyway, forcing his failing body to function through sheer will. Witnesses described him as visibly weakened, easily fatigued, his face looking like a skull with skin stretched over it. His hands trembled. His voice sometimes faded to barely a whisper. Photographs from Yalta compared to Tehran 14 months earlier show a shocking transformation. The man at Tehran looked tired. The man at Yalta looked like death. The military situation gave Stalin overwhelming leverage. Soviet armies controlled Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and were 65 kilometers from Berlin. The question wasn't whether Germany would be defeated, but how Europe would be divided afterward. Roosevelt came to Yalta with two primary goals. First, secure Soviet entry into the war against Japan, because American military planners estimated the Pacific War could last another 18 months and cost 1 million American casualties. If Soviets attacked Japan from the north, the war could shorten dramatically. Second, get Stalin to agree to United Nations framework, Roosevelt's dream of a post-war international organization preventing future conflicts. Stalin came knowing exactly what he wanted and having the power to take it. He wanted territorial concessions in the Pacific, the Kuril Islands, southern Sakhalin Island, recognition of Outer Mongolia's independence, railroad rights in Manchuria. He wanted Poland's borders moved westward with Eastern Territory going to the Soviet Union. He wanted reparations from Germany. And he wanted the West to accept, implicitly or explicitly, Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. The negotiations exposed Roosevelt's declining capacity. He couldn't sustain long sessions, needed frequent breaks. His attention wandered. Admiral William Lahey, his chief of staff, watched with alarm as Roosevelt struggled through meetings that Stalin handled with cold efficiency. Some evidence suggests Roosevelt's mind remained sharp when he could focus, though. State Department officials noted his comments during negotiations reflected briefing papers almost verbatim. He understood the issues. He just lacked physical stamina to fight for better terms. On Poland, the outcome was predetermined by Soviet military control, but dressed up as compromise. The eastern border would follow the Curzon Line, giving Soviets significant territory. Poland would be compensated with German land to the west, moving to the Oder and Neisse rivers. The Lublin government, which Stalin had installed and controlled, would be reorganized on a broader democratic basis with free and unfettered elections. Admiral Lahey read the agreement and told Roosevelt bluntly, "Mr. President, this is so elastic that the Russians can stretch it all the way from Yalta to Washington without ever technically breaking it." Roosevelt replied, "I know, Bill, but it's the best I can do for Poland at this time." That exchange captures Yalta's tragedy. Roosevelt knew the agreement was weak, knew Stalin's promises about free elections meant nothing. He lacked the leverage to demand more, and possibly lacked the energy to fight harder. On Germany, the Big Three agreed to divide the country into occupation zones administered by American, British, French, and Soviet forces. Germany would be demilitarized, war criminals prosecuted, reparations paid though specific amounts were left for future determination. On the Pacific, Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan within 2 to 3 months after Germany's surrender. In return, Soviets would receive territorial concessions in Manchuria and the islands. The agreement was kept secret, even from the Chinese, who would lose territory under its terms. On the United Nations, Stalin made concessions Roosevelt considered victories. Soviets backed down from demanding separate membership for all 16 Soviet republics, settling for 3: Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. They agreed to a voting structure in the Security Council that included a veto for permanent members but allowed other nations representation. Roosevelt left Yalta believing he'd accomplished something historic. He'd secured Soviet entry against Japan, established United Nations framework, gotten Stalin to agree to free elections in Eastern Europe, even if the agreement was vague. Within 6 weeks, though, Roosevelt would realize his mistake. Stalin immediately began consolidating control in Poland, installing communist governments across Eastern Europe, ignoring every promise made at Yalta about democratic processes. March 23, 1945. Just 20 days before his death, Roosevelt told Anna Rosenberg, "Averell is right. We can't do business with Stalin. He has broken every one of the promises he made at Yalta." By then, it was too late. Soviet armies controlled the territory, the agreements were signed, the post-war order was set, and Roosevelt was dying. The historical debate over Yalta has raged for decades. Critics argue Roosevelt gave away too much, that his illness impaired judgment, that a healthy president would have negotiated harder. They point to Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain for 45 years as proof of Yalta's failure. Defenders argue Roosevelt got the best deal possible given Soviet military dominance, that no amount of negotiation would have dislodged Stalin from territory his armies controlled, that the real failure was believing Stalin would honor any agreement, not the agreements themselves. Everyone agrees on one thing, though. Roosevelt was too sick to be at Yalta. His body was failing. His stamina was gone. He was negotiating the shape of the post-war world while racing against death. And death was winning. When Roosevelt returned from Yalta in March 1945, he was exhausted, beyond recovery. March 1st, he addressed Congress about the conference, sitting down for the first time in his presidency, apologizing for it, but unable to stand. His speech rambled. His delivery was weak. He looked like a ghost. The man who'd traveled to Yalta, believing he could charm Stalin into cooperation, came home realizing he'd failed. The man who'd hidden his illness to serve his country one more term came home knowing he wouldn't finish it. The man who'd shaped the Allied victory was coming apart physically just as that victory approached. And the world he'd negotiated at Yalta, the compromises he'd accepted, the concessions he'd made, would define the next half-century of human history. Eastern Europe would live under Soviet domination until 1989. The Cold War would be fought along lines drawn at Yalta. Millions would live and die under consequences of agreements made by a dying man in a Crimean palace. Roosevelt had 6 weeks left to live. 6 weeks to watch his Yalta agreements collapse as Stalin revealed his true intentions. 6 weeks to realize that his personal diplomacy, his faith in human connection overcoming ideology, had been naive. 6 weeks to understand that the price of his deception about his health might be paid by people he'd never meet in countries he'd tried to save. April 1945. Franklin Roosevelt returned to Warm Springs, Georgia, his refuge since the 1920s, when polio paralyzed him, and this place offered hope of recovery. He'd come here dozens of times over the years to rest, to swim in warm mineral waters, to escape Washington's pressure. This time was different, though. This time he came to die. The journey back from Yalta had destroyed whatever reserves he had left. Through March, cabinet members and closest advisors watched him deteriorate with horrifying speed. At the last cabinet meeting on March 29th and 30th, colleagues were shocked by what they saw. He looked ancient. His hands shook constantly. His voice faded in and out. He struggled to follow conversations. The weight loss that started in 1944 continued relentlessly. Eggnog supplements didn't work. Digitalis was stopped and restarted as doctors tried desperately to find a combination that would restore his appetite. Nothing worked. His body was consuming itself, cardiac cachexia, of end-stage heart failure eating away muscle and fat. Pain became constant. Severe abdominal episodes related to gallbladder problems, headaches that wouldn't respond to medication, the physical toll of hypertension at crisis levels, with his heart straining to pump blood through vessels that could barely handle the pressure. Whispers about cancer circulated, never confirmed, but never fully dismissed. Eleanor had allegedly told actress Veronica Lake in January that Roosevelt had prostate cancer. If true, treatment options in 1945 were primitive and brutal. The disease would have been another burden on a body already failing from multiple causes. Roosevelt pushed on through March anyway, trying to work, trying to maintain the appearance of control, even as control slipped away. He watched Stalin break Yalta agreements one by one. Poland's promised free elections never materialized. Communist governments were installed across Eastern Europe. Soviets arrested Polish resistance leaders who'd fought the Nazis. Every promise Stalin made at Yalta was revealed as a lie. And Roosevelt, finally, understood. 20 days before his death, he admitted to Anna Rosenberg what he'd been too stubborn or too sick to see at Yalta. Avril is right. We can't do business with Stalin. He has broken every one of the promises he made at Yalta. The realization came too late. The agreements were signed, the world was divided, and Roosevelt was out of time to fix it. Early April, he left Washington for Warm Springs. His staff knew why. He needed rest desperately. His doctors hoped warm climate and mineral baths might give him some relief. Everyone close to Roosevelt understood this trip had a different quality, though. He looked like a man preparing to die. April 12th, 1945, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Roosevelt sat in the living room of his cottage at Warm Springs, signing papers and sitting for a portrait. Artist Elizabeth Shumatoff was painting him, trying to capture what was left of the president's vitality on canvas. Roosevelt raised his hand to his head, his face contorting in pain. "I have a terrific headache," he said. Those were his last words. He slumped forward, losing consciousness instantly. Dr. Howard Bruenn, the cardiologist who'd been monitoring Roosevelt's decline for over a year, was summoned immediately. He examined the president and found what he dreaded. Blood pressure of 300 over 190, catastrophically high. A massive cerebral hemorrhage was destroying Roosevelt's brain. Bruenn tried everything he could, but there was nothing to be done. The stroke was too severe. Roosevelt never regained consciousness. At 3:35 p.m., Franklin Delano Roosevelt was pronounced dead. He was 63 years old. He'd been president for 12 years, 1 month and 8 days. He'd led America through the Depression and to the brink of victory in World War II. And he died exactly as Dr. Lahey had predicted 10 months earlier, his body unable to complete the 4th term. The photograph taken the day before, April 11th, became known as the last photograph. It shows Roosevelt looking not 63 but 80, gaunt and hollow-eyed, the life already draining from him. It's an image of a man who'd given everything to his country and had nothing left to give. News of Roosevelt's death shocked the nation. The press reported it as sudden and unexpected, the New York Times using those exact words on its front page. Admiral McIntyre, who'd lied about Roosevelt's health for over a year, continued lying even after death. He told reporters, "This came out of clear sky." It hadn't come out of a clear sky, though. It had been inevitable since at least March 1944 when Bruenn diagnosed congestive heart failure. Predictable since July 1944 when Lahey warned Roosevelt couldn't finish another term. Everyone in the inner circle knew it was coming. They just didn't know exactly when. Harry Truman was summoned to the White House at 5:25 p.m. Eleanor Roosevelt told him simply, "Harry, the president is dead." Truman asked what he could do for her. Eleanor replied, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." She was right. Truman had been vice president for 82 days. Roosevelt had met with him only twice. He didn't know about the atomic bomb weeks from completion, didn't know the details of Yalta agreements, didn't understand the complexity of Soviet relations, or the extent of Stalin's betrayal. He was utterly unprepared for the job that had just fallen on him. Roosevelt's body was carried by train back to Washington with full military honors. Crowds lined the streets, units of the armed forces stood at attention. Thousands of citizens grieved. Americans under 30 had known no other president. For many, Roosevelt was the only leader they'd ever had, the voice that had guided them through depression and war. At Hyde Park, Roosevelt was buried in the rose garden of his estate. He never saw VE Day, which would come less than a month later on May 8th. He never saw VJ Day and the final end of the war on September 2nd. The victory he'd worked toward, the peace he'd tried to build, the United Nations he'd dreamed of creating, all would happen without him. The cover-up didn't end with his death. Decades would pass before the full truth emerged, before Bruenn's medical notes became available, before Daisy Suckley's diaries were discovered, before historians like Robert Farrell could piece together exactly how sick Roosevelt was, and how deliberately that sickness was hidden from the American people. History's verdict remains divided. Was Roosevelt a hero who gave his life serving his country? Or was he a man whose ego and stubbornness endangered the nation by refusing to step aside when his health failed? Did his presence at Yalta help or hurt? Would Truman or another president have negotiated better terms with Stalin? Would Eastern Europe have fallen behind the Iron Curtain regardless of who sat across from Stalin? These questions have no certain answers. What's certain is that Franklin Roosevelt died trying to win the war and build the peace. That he hid his illness because he believed he was indispensable. That his death left America with an unprepared president at the most critical moment in the 20th century. And that the world shaped in his final year, in those negotiations at Yalta conducted while his body failed, and defined the Cold War that would dominate the next half-century. Roosevelt had said famously that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. In his final year, though, he feared admitting his own mortality. He feared that without him, the alliance with Stalin would fail, the United Nations wouldn't be born, the peace wouldn't be won. That fear drove him to run for a fourth term he couldn't finish, drove him to Yalta when he should have been in a hospital, and may have cost millions of people in Eastern Europe their freedom for 45 years. Or perhaps he was right. Perhaps only Roosevelt could have held the alliance together long enough to defeat Hitler. Perhaps his presence, even dying, was necessary to get Stalin to agree to anything at all. Perhaps a healthy president would have done no better given Soviet military control of Eastern Europe. History doesn't offer clear verdicts on questions like these. It offers only the facts. And the facts are these. Franklin Roosevelt ran the final year of World War II while dying of heart disease. He hid that fact from the American people. He made decisions at Yalta that shaped the post-war world. And he died before seeing whether those decisions would lead to the lasting peace he'd fought for or the Cold War they helped create. The answer, as it turned out, was both.